How long was your career in the industry?
Yeah, I worked about 35 years in the industry.
You retired from ACBL 3 years ago, or
I retired from ACBL in 2006,
okay,
and I actually started my career. Well, I have an interesting story about between the levees. When we were little boys, we grew up in Hartford, Illinois, and my great grandmother had this great big oak tree. And if you got to the top of the tree on Cherry Street there, you could see over the levee and see the boats and the barges. And so when we were kids, we would climb that tree, and the older we got, the easier it got. When we were really young, it was nervous trying to get up there because you had to get to the top of the tree to see between the levees. And I thought it interesting you named your podcast Between the Levees. And my first experience with the river was between the levees from that oak tree in my grandma's backyard.
yeah, I grew up in New Orleans. Of course, you see ship stacks going over the levee, but I never. It was just a fascinating wonder, out there over the water. Never knew a thing about it. Found my way into it in mid 2015 with AEP, and I haven't looked back.
Yeah,
But
it's in, yeah.
I was listening back to your brother's episode, which premiered about a month before this one, Will, and realized that I did not ask him where he was born. Uh, he did fill me in a little bit on how you found your way into the industry. I understand you were first in the family to find your way to it. So let's walk our way through where you were born, life growing up, your siblings, schooling, what steered you toward the industry, and how your career got started.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we grew up in Hartford, Illinois, which is right at the confluence of the Missouri, Mississippi River. It's where Lewis and Clark, they actually had a camp where they started their trek up the Missouri River, and there's a big park there in memorial to them there. And it's also just south of where the Illinois River comes in Grafton, Illinois, which is about 30 miles north of there. And so it's a big area for rivers, and it's right between Lock and Dam 26 and Lock and Dam 27. Obviously, Lock 27 is the last dam on the upper Mississippi River. And so when I was went to the University, Southern Illinois University after graduating from high school, I was in a restaurant bussing tables and dishwashing, and I heard a gentleman talking to a waitress that was his girlfriend saying, "Man, I sure need to find somebody to go to work for us." And when she left, I went over, I said, "Mr. Kays, could I interview for that job you're talking about?" I said, "I need to work a lot more hours. I just don't have the money to go to school and I need work." And he said, "Well, yes, come down and see me." So I went down the next day and he hired me as a night watchman. And I worked 60 hours a week for 3.5 years and graduated from university. And my job as night watchman was that I'd work either 4 to 12s or midnight to late every other week. And then I'd work 12 hours on the weekend and paid at like $1.25 an hour or something like that when I started. Got up maybe $1.50 an hour. And I needed that money to go to school, and I ended up getting married while I was in school and that sort of thing. But the important part of that is my river career is that we gave all the supplies to the boats. We fueled the boats. We helped them make crew change. I got to know every captain, every pilot, every deckhand, every cook. I knew everybody on all the boats by name. And I'd even call and talk to their families and get them to come to the boat at times for the crew dispatcher at the time and that sort of thing. And so when I graduated, I thought, well, that's the end of my river career. And I went to work as a teacher. And I worked 2 years as a teacher, and I got a call from Jack Hines at SCNO Barge Lines. And SCNO stands for Sioux City and New Orleans. And Sioux City is the highest navigable point on the Missouri River. And of course, New Orleans is the terminus of the Mississippi River. And we were the major barge line carrier on the Missouri River for the entire time that I worked with SCNO. They were owned by a family named Henry Crown out of Chicago. And at one time, Henry Crown was one of the fourth richest men in the United States. And he actually loaned Conrad Hilton the money to start the Hilton hotels. So how's that for an interesting story? We were staying in a Hilton one time in New Orleans, and I picked up a book in there, and there was a picture of Mr. Crown and Conrad Hilton together with a story about how he started the hotels. And so anyway, the Crowns owned us for the entire time that I worked for SCNO. And when I was teaching, I got a call from Jack Hines, and Mr. Hines asked me, he said, would you like to come back and be crew dispatcher? And I thought about that, and I said, well, what's the pay, Mr. Hines? And he said, it pays $9,300 a year. And I was making $7,500 as a teacher. And I thought, you know, this would be an opportunity to do something different in life and maybe have a good career if I decide to do this. So I made the switch, even though I had to work 12 months instead of 9 months.
What year would this have been?
This would have been in 1973, I guess, 74.
Okay, thank you.
And I went to work for SCNO. And the interesting story, the first day I walked into the office, the old crew dispatcher was a gentleman named Brother Collins. And he was such a beloved person. He called everybody brother, and everybody on the river knew Brother Collins. They loved Brother Collins. He lived in St. Louis. And when I went in, he didn't know I was replacing him. They hadn't told him that they were having a replacement come in for him. And we were good friends, and it kind of hurt my feelings and hurt his feelings, but he was a very nice gentleman about it. And then I became crew dispatcher, and he retired. And so that's how I actually got back into the river industry and began working in the river industry.
Where did you study in school, and what did you teach?
Yeah, I studied at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. I graduated with a degree in history. I taught at 1 year in Roxana, and then the next year I taught at Ferguson Florissant. And then the second year I was at Ferguson Florissant. When I got the call from SCNO, it was when they had actually started the busing of kids from Kinloch into Ferguson. And from the Meredith decision, I don't know if you remember that, it's back when they first segregated the schools, or integrated the schools, actually, excuse me. And it turned into, that was another reason I actually went to the barge line business. I could see that there's going to be a real effort to try to teach and have a learning environment when half the kids didn't want to be there and the other half didn't want them there. And it was just, so it helped make my decision to move into the barge line also. That's another reason I moved.
Well, tell me about your introduction to the industry, and then walk me through what became a 35-year career.
Sure. So when I went to, after I went to SCNO, I had an opportunity to work for a gentleman there who was in charge of claims, and that's who I reported to, and insurance. And he started training me in claims and insurance. I ended up being the claims manager and handled insurance and that sort of thing. And then I had an opportunity to go in operations. Again, because I knew everybody on the towboats, I knew all the captains and all the pilots and everybody. And I had worked as a deckhand during the summers a couple times. So I had some experience on the towboats. And so when I had a chance to move into operations, I did, and became operations manager. We moved our operations to Hartford, believe it or not. And we had a facility there called Mr. Cole, where all the boats would come and they would crew change and get fuel and get stores and all that sort of thing. We had a big warehouse and that sort of thing. And so then I was operations manager, I guess, for 10 years at SCNO, and was a great experience. I learned a lot about towboating. We had some great, the first thing I learned when I got into operations is how important captains were. And I knew some really, at that time, and even today, if you talk to any old timers, Wilbur MacArthur, Captain Mack, he was from Pearlington, Mississippi, and Jim Brown was from Paducah, Kentucky, and Junior Carroll's from down Paducah, Kentucky area. Bill Leland and Jimmy King. Jimmy King is Jerry King's dad. I don't know if you know Jerry King or not. He's been in the industry a long time. And his dad, Jimmy King, was one of my captains. And then we even had another captain by the name of Dan Hayes. Dan Hayes was from the Bro Bridge area. And everybody on his boat was Cajun. And so we had a whole Cajun boat. It was called the Crescent City was the name of the boat. And they had an engineer on there by the name of Bud Dacus, and you could eat off the engine room floors. It was so clean. It's the cleanest engine room I've ever been on any towboat I've ever been on. And so I knew those people, and what was important about that is I found out quickly how important the captains and wheelhouse people are in the towing industry. You're as good as your wheelhouse people. And I always carried that with me the rest of my career as I went through the different areas I worked in. I've actually sailed from Sioux City all the way to Hartford, where we went into the Mississippi River, and then I've actually ridden a towboat all the way from St. Louis all the way to New Orleans several times. And so I got to see a lot of the river.
How quickly did you develop that appreciation for the captains and personnel out there that are doing this for us?
I think I always had it kind of in me because of working there and just when I was decking in the summer and stuff, just watching the skill that these guys had and everything. And then when I actually started riding on the towboats and watching these guys go through bridges and taking these different tows and things through bridges, taking 30 barges through that time the Greenville Bridge was just a terrible, terrible effort to try to get through there safely, and especially if you had any kind of high water or anything like that, a lot of accidents and things. But it didn't take very long to understand the skill of these guys, and we'll talk about a little bit when I went to Venezuela and a couple other places. I took with me the importance of proper training for these guys and how important it was to the success of a company.
Well, what happened after SCNO?
Well, that's an interesting question. Somewhere around 1987, I think it was, ACBL. Let me just back up a step. So ACBL was bought by a company called CSX, which is a rail company. And
where did ACBL begin? Who were they owned by at first? Like, what's their story?
ACBL's story, I'd have to think about that. I hadn't given much thought to that. I do know that story, and I can't remember very well. But they were around for a long time. They were very, very big barge lines, and they were out of Jeffersonville, Indiana, across the river from Louisville, Kentucky, and they had been around for a long time. They had a lot of equipment. They were much bigger than the rest of us, and then they were bought by the railroad by CSX, and they decided they were going to. So when CSX was going to buy ACBL, the industry, including SCNO, we all put funds in and tried to stop the merger, calling it a monopoly. And I would have bet the house that they would have never let the transaction go through, and I would have lost my house because they did let it go through. And the railroad bought the largest barge lines at that time, and they just became the dominant player in the game. So then ACBL started buying all these companies up. And the first one they bought was SCNO. And so when they bought us, I think we had like 50 people in the office and around doing different things. And I think 5 of us ended up going to Jeffersonville to work in the office over there. And I got to go. And I think one reason I got to go was interesting is that we were a non-union company. And all of ACBL was unionized at that time. And so we went over there and we became a separate division in the operations group from the operations people. And we operated, and the first thing they did was quit running the Missouri River. So I had to get all my captains and stuff who were so used to running the Missouri River, had to get them familiarized to run the Upper Miss and the Illinois and the Ohio and that sort of thing. But a good captain's a good captain. They'll adapt and they can learn to run anywhere if they're a good wheelman, which most of my guys were. And so we went over there, and then they decided they were going to merge all the things together, and they let all the SCNO guys become union people. And a job opened up as fleet manager of all the fleets north of Baton Rouge. So that was all the fleets from Minnesota and from Pittsburgh all the way down to Baton Rouge. Cairo was a big hub for us, obviously. And so I managed those fleets for a couple years. And then Jim Bukey asked me if I would consider going to New Orleans to be over logistics and customer service. And that was in 1992. And I thought in operations, I would have a hard time because ACBL had a very good operations group. It was run by a fellow by the name of Chris Brinkup and Norb Whitlock, and they both ran a really, really good show. And they had a good operations group there. And I was glad to be a part of that, but I saw that if I was going to advance my career, I need to do something else. So I agreed with Buki to go take over the distribution and customer service in the Gulf. And I moved to Harahan, Louisiana in 1992.
And where did life take you from there?
Well, in 1992 was an interesting time. You know, we had, as you probably know, we had 1,000 barges any one day south of Baton Rouge to Brownsville, Texas, to St. Marks, Florida. And that was our territory. And the thing I always said I learned in New Orleans was patience. Because let the fog come in any one day and everybody wants their barge yesterday. And had really good people work for me. Pat Morton, Mike O'Neill, several other people, but those are two that really come to mind quickly. And I had really, really good people, and I learned a lot down there. And as would happen, ACBL expanded into South America. And they had an operation in Venezuela to start, and they moved 4 5,600 towboats, some harbor boats, and 120 barges, I guess, to Port Ordaz, Venezuela, which is on the Orinoco River. And Port Ordaz is 195 miles up from the mouth of where the Orinoco goes into the Atlantic Ocean. And they filled submersibles, took these barges by submersible into Venezuela and set up an operation with their own dry docks, with their own facilities, their own wheel repair group. A gentleman by the name of Oscar Kurth and Del Wilkins were the two that started it. And then 4 years later, they decided they were going to open up in Argentina. So Oscar, they asked, I knew they were looking for somebody to run the operations down there, I'd heard, and I applied for the job and asked them if I could be considered for it. Of course, I did not speak Spanish at the time, and but I knew I could learn Spanish. I was pretty confident in myself. And so Oscar said, yes, I'll give you a chance to run this for us. And so I went to Port Ordaz and lived in Port Ordaz, rented a house down there and went to work down there. And Oscar spent part of his time there and then part of his time in Argentina. And then he finally just turned it over to me. And I actually replaced Oscar and Del and became the manager of operations for ACBL de Venezuela. And I did that for 10 years. And I went down there for what I thought was one. And when I went down there, first thing I did was they have a siesta like they do in Spain, which is a 2-hour break every day from noon till 2 o'clock. And the schools don't have cafeterias. People go to school and get their kids, take them home, feed them, take them back to school and drop them. And I didn't have kids at the time, so I didn't pay much attention to that sort of thing. But I would go to Berlitz 3 times a week, and I'd take Spanish 2 hours a day. And it took me about 6 weeks. And one night we were sitting in a restaurant, and I'll never forget this. And all of a sudden I heard 2 different conversations going on at the same time in Spanish. It's the first time that it realized, you know what, yo por hablar español si yo quiero, that I could speak Spanish if I wanted to. And from then my Spanish was pretty good. And so it was quite a learning experience the first year down there, but I liked it. It was a nice environment, and there's a lot of stories I can tell you about Venezuela that are really interesting about my experience there. And again, I thought I was going to go for 1 year, and I ended up staying 10, and it probably didn't hurt that about 3 years into my stay down there, I met my wife, that we've been married 25 years now. In fact, we celebrated 25 years this month. And so that's probably another reason I stayed there as long as I did. But I enjoyed the work. It was a great opportunity for me. We had a 10-year contract moving bauxite from the bauxite mine, which was, I think, mile marker, it was like 300, I can't remember exactly what it was. It was 300 and some 50 miles, I think, to the bauxite mine. And you could go by car, but the roads were terrible. And we moved bauxite from the mine back down. And bauxite, for people who don't know, is a red dirt. And it's only in areas of the country of the world that are really, really old. And they take this red bauxite and they make alumina. And alumina looks like white baby powder. And they take alumina and they make aluminum from the alumina. So the government, CVG, owned a bauxite mine. They owned an alumina plant where they made alumina, the white powder. And then they used that white powder and they had an alumina plant where they made aluminum. And it was all imported to us. And so our goal was to move bauxite for them. The first trip that ACBL made up the river and back down, there was another company, they were a competitor. The first trip that ACBL made up the river and back down, they moved 60% more product in 40% more time. And I think bauxite and CVG, all of a sudden their eyes popped and said, this could really be something for us. And so when I went down there, I guess that started in, let's see, 2000. I guess 1991, they started. 1992, the business started. And they had a 10-year contract with Bauxite that a gentleman by the name of Lou Meese had put together with Mike Hagan to move the bauxite for him. And so in 2001, when the contract was up, I negotiated another contract, all in Spanish, for another 10 years. And we were able to have it there until I left in 2006 and the contract went on. And we can talk about that a little bit too. Because a couple things happened. Well, I wanted to tell you one other story before I get off there when I was down there. So as always, I decided I wanted to understand how the river works, watch the river, see the river, understand what people were dealing with. It was a free-flowing river. There was no locks and dams on it. So it was like the lower Mississippi River. And it was controlled by rainfall up in the Everglades, up in the mountains and in the different areas. And we have navigate about 7 months a year. So everything we did, we had to do in 7 months. And then there were 5 months where we repaired boats. Our boats were in exceptional condition. We would cut the steel. The boats that we took down there were like 20 years old, but we would cut the bottom plates out and all that stuff and replace them with new steel and everything. And they looked like brand new boats. And my goal was to have 0 down days for the 7 months that we operated on any of the towboats. Everybody's bonus was based on that. But all of our goals were set on that. And it was also on safety. And while I was down there, we went 5 years in a row and got the Jones-Devlin Award, which is the award you get for no accidents or any type of injury or anything on any of your towboats. And we went 5 years doing that. And I was really proud of that, which gets me back to the story I was going to tell you about our wheelhouse people. So we had American trainers teaching the Venezuelan people how to run towboats. And I ended up with what I always call the cowboys off the Mississippi River: Grady Gibbs, Vic, Kim Danielson, Tammy White, all these guys who are just exceptional wheelhouse people. And they trained these Venezuelans so well that these Venezuelans didn't realize that you could take 30 barge tows up and down the Orinoco River without ever thinking about it. When I went down there, they were moving 25 barge tows and moving, I don't know, maybe 1,500 tons in a barge. And after I was down there and these guys got so good, we started loading the barges to a foot and a half of freeboard and putting 30 barges in each tow. And it just made the numbers so much better financially because we were able to move so much more product in this short period of time. And the Venezuelans just became extremely good pilots. And in the off time, the wheelhouse people would come to the U.S. and ride on U.S. boats to watch how it was done, that sort of thing. I'm sure they actually ran the boats, but nobody would say that because you have to have a license here in the U.S. and all that. But I'm sure they became very good friends with a lot of these Americans. And it was an interesting experience, very interesting experience.
Well, feel free to share any stories that you do come to mind to highlight things down there. But I've interviewed on this show Dale Wilkins, Jeff Stevens, and Captain David Greer.
Yeah,
a fair amount.
Another good man, David. Forgot about David.
Yeah, he covered the experience down there in some detail, but your perspective will be different than his. So please, any stories you have to share about those 3 individuals, working with them, and the experiences down there in South America, by all means, feel free.
Yeah, Dale Wilkins is a really good man. So is Jeff Stevens. I've known Jeff. I actually, when I was student teaching, I had Jeff in class in the 8th grade. I was teaching 8th grade at Bethalto as a student teacher. Jeff Stevens was in one of my classes, and I knew his family real well. His dad, Daryl Stevens, he and Art Heinricher had a business down in Granite City that they ended up selling down there. And Daryl Stevens, Jeff's dad, was really, really fine gentleman too. Just really, and really good river people. They understood the business. Daryl was a pilot. Jeff was a heck of a pilot. Both really, really good wheelhouse people. And which was different than I really didn't have the wheelhouse experience like they did, but I did understand the business. And I also understand the importance of safety and how to run an operation and that sort of thing. The story I was laughing about, I was going to tell you, is that we first went up there. One of the Venezuelan captains said, "You really should meet this Indian chief because they help us a lot when we need stuff." And I said, "Okay." So we go into this Indian camp. I mean, it's right on the river. And we get there and there's tents set up and all kinds of stuff. And there's this big old piece of meat with flies all over it and everything. And apparently they would load the bauxite at the mine. When they load the bauxite at the mine, they dump it down this huge conveyor and bring it down. They have huge piles of bauxite. And then they take it 50 kilometers by a train to the river. And then the train cars would dump into and load the barges from the rail dump. And they ended up, had a terrible time with the Indians because they kept hitting cows and stuff that the Indians were trying to raise and stuff. So they finally built a fence down the track and everything. But every once in a while, the cow would get loose, the train would hit it. And if it did, they'd go get the meat and they'd bring it. And that's what they'd have for lunch and dinner and stuff. So this Indian, I see this guy this big Indian guy comes up from the river, and he's clean, his hair, and he'd just taken a bath. And they introduced us, and he said, "Would you like some coffee?" And I thought to myself, if I don't get coffee, he's going to want me to stay for lunch. And I don't really want to stay for lunch because I don't know what we're going to eat. So I had a cup of coffee, and I determined that probably because they boil the water, it'd be all right to drink the coffee, which I did. But it was a good experience, and I'll connect that with another story I'll tell you in a minute about the Indians that were down there that we had on the River Orinoco Indians. But I thought that was an interesting story that I would meet this gentleman like that. And I don't know how many barge people have ever had a chance to meet an Orinoco Indian and have coffee with him. So.
Well, no, please continue by all means. Stories of South America and watchman to whatever happened next.
Yeah, I have a couple more Venezuelan stories that I thought were interesting when I lived on there. One of them was how we lost our Devlin Jones record for no accidents. We had a 30 barge tow of empty barges going northbound, and there was about a month left in the season. And they got to this place. There's a place in the river that's a big bend if you're coming south, and they have, if you go at nighttime, it's just amazing. They have all these lights across the river that are sparkling and electric and all this sort of thing, and the sound is just huge. And the roar of the river, and they have these huge rocks, they're called pinnacle rocks, that come up out of the bottom of the river that had been there for years. And the water right there is about 160 to 170 foot deep when you come down that bend and come around there. Well, we had a boat going northbound with empties with an American trainer on it. And they marked the river with buoys, but they tied the buoys to the rocks. That's how they didn't have them anchored. They had them tied to rocks and stuff. And nobody paid much attention as the river fell. The buoys went towards the shore. And they obviously weren't paying a lot of attention. They came around the bend, and the barge tow went over the pinnacle rock, but the bow of the boat did not, and they ripped a hole in the bow of the boat. They knocked the tow loose. After the river came down and we saw it, I still today don't know how in the world they got the boat to the shore without sinking the boat. They had this huge hole in the boat. So the tow goes off down the river. There is another boat around for probably 100 miles in either direction. And would you believe there was two Indians in a canoe, and there was a line, and the barge went to shore, and they grabbed it and tied the tow off the tree, and we didn't lose a single barge.
That's pretty incredible.
It is, and the Indians had a camp there, and so we rented the camp from them, and they had lodging and stuff, and we took generators and stuff, and it took us a couple of weeks. We brought a bunch of people from the U.S. to help us, and we ended up actually raising that towboat. And the interesting story about that towboat, we couldn't figure out how to get that towboat up, and I had an engineer, my port engineer down there. Most of my people were all college educated. That was another thing I was going to mention to you. A lot of these Venezuelans that worked on these boats were all college educated, and there were no jobs. And so we paid well. I always tried to pay more than anybody else to keep these guys. I mean, you spend all the money training them. You don't want them to go somewhere else. You want to keep them. And in my 10 years there, I think I had one person leave, and he ended up coming back to work. But we paid well and took care of these guys, sent them to the U.S. and trained them. They sent them to simulator school and things like that. And anyway, my engineer, we were talking about it, and we were getting ready to quit from that. My engineer said, Jim, I think we can pump this boat up if you just let me try this. Well, we talked I said something to Americans, they retired. Well, so I told Enzo, his name was Enzo Corlucci, who still works for ACBL of Venezuela. I said, you know what, Enzo, if I were you, I'd go test those pumps, make sure they work in the morning. And he kind of smiles at me, looks. He said, really? I said, yeah, I would. He goes down and starts all these pumps and starts pumping. All of a sudden, the boat starts coming up. They kept pumping and pumping. And then by that time, everybody rushes down and everybody's got involved in trying to get this thing up and everything. And they were able to get the hole blocked in the bow of the boat and get a mattress or something on to stop the water from coming in as much. And I'll never forget when the boat came out of the water, one of the deckhands on that boat kissed the deck of the boat because we'd saved his boat from sinking. And that was, I'll never forget, we had a little boat that we had on the outside that Bill Kinsler and I stayed on. It's kind of like a cabin boat. We had it tied off there, and we'd get out, and Kinsler and I would take a bath every night in the Orinoco, hanging on the ladder, washing in the river there. And I always thought to myself, we let go of this, we're going to be a long swim downstream here. But we had a interesting experience. I got that boat raised and got out of the river just before the river closed, and we were able to repair the boat and put it back into work next year. But I always thought that was an interesting story.
Indeed. You mentioned before we started recording, there was a story tied to a gentleman named Hugo Chavez. You want to share that one?
Yes, sir. I'd be glad to. And it is an interesting story. When I went down to Venezuela, the first 5 years was without Chavez, and my next 5 was with Chavez. And I had an opportunity to meet Hugo Chavez 3 or 4 times. And one time he wanted to navigate on the Apure River, which is a river that runs off of the Orinoco and is something like the Illinois River to the Mississippi. Actually, more like the Missouri River because there's no locks and dams, but it was a smaller river than the Missouri. And they wanted to navigate that. So he wanted us to go up there and see if we could navigate it. And they had navigated it years before, apparently. And unfortunately, they had a bridge that was in the down position that they couldn't get up. And so they promised that they would have the bridge fixed and taken care of that and all that sort of thing. So we invited Hugo Chavez to get on our towboat. He wanted to see what towboat was about. So he came and got on the boat with us. He's on the boat with us about 3 hours. He was a big baseball fan. He actually threw the first pitch out for the Yankees in one of the games in the U.S. here when they were still speaking with Americans a little bit. And so I met him, and he left, and we had our tow, and we took our tow up to the bridge. Nothing ever happened to the bridge. We sat there 2 or 3 days, nothing ever happened. So we brought the tow back, and that was the end of navigating on the Prairie River at that time with Hugo Chavez. I met him in a couple other meetings, and I don't know for sure, but he certainly was very crude. His Spanish was very crude, and he was a dictator, and he acted like a dictator, and that's what he ended up being. And so it ended up in 2006, we could all kind of read the writing on the walls that this was not going to be a good situation in Venezuela. And so after discussing between ourselves, we decided we would sell the company to the minority partners. And they bought the company out. And so in 2006, at the end of the year, I basically retired from ACBL and moved back to the US.
Well, what came next for you?
Well, that's an interesting story. So I did 2 or 3 things. First thing I did, I retired too early and ran out of money and decided and knew I had to go back to work and do something. But one of the opportunities I had is that they wanted somebody to sound the Apuri River. By this time, I was very concerned because things were a lot of strife between the US and Venezuela, and Americans weren't widely accepted down there. And I said, you know, I'll do it on a couple conditions. I said, one, I want paid in American dollars here in the US by you. And secondly, I want my safety guaranteed on this trip. And he said, okay, I'll get back to you. And they called me back and said, okay, all your conditions are met. So I flew to Caracas and was met there, and we went to Apuri, Venezuela, which is a little town there. And when I got down there and walked down the ramp, Venezuelans had 2 gunboats with machine guns on the back of them and about 20 soldiers on another boat there waiting for me. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to be safe on this trip. So I took sounding equipment and I sounded the river. And the first night we stayed at this place, and it was a big old barn. And we go into this barn, they have hammocks. And when we went in the barn, we had lanterns and things for lights, flashlights, I guess. And there's pictures of Che Guevara and Hugo Chavez drawings, names and sayings all over the inside of this barn. And apparently it's a very, very populous area for the people and everything. And we slept in hammocks. We wake up next morning and there's like 20 Venezuelan local ladies that had cooked all this breakfast for us. We had all this arepas and all this Venezuelan food. And we go back on the boat and we finish the trip, and I fly back to the US. I write the report on the river, all the different places where the shallow spots were, where the deep spots were. Did I think it could be navigated? Yes, definitely could be navigated. It was done correctly and everything. Then I never hear another word about my surveying of the Apuri River for a long time. Which brings me to my next part of my life on the river industry. And then in 2017-18, I got a call from a company called Trafigura. They're the 3rd largest trading company in the world. They're huge, and they're out of Switzerland. And they wanted to start up navigation on the Magdalena River in Colombia. And so I got a deal with them that I would go down there and work and get navigation started on the Magdalena River. And so I got down there, and they were building all these barges that were being made in Europe, and they weren't American-style barges. They weren't American-style boats. And by the time I got there, they had a lot of equipment in there, and it really wasn't the right equipment for navigating the river, but it would work, and we were able to work with it. And I knew immediately that I needed help, so I asked Tammy White if he would come down and be my port captain, and he moved down there with me. And I did not take my wife because our daughter was in school. And so I would come back and forth, but I spent most of my time down there trying to get navigation on the Magdalena River. And what was interesting about the story, which we did, and then ended up with Jeff Stevens coming down later, we finally decided we needed more help other than just Tammy and I. We ended up getting Jeff Stevens to come down, and Jeff came down, and he brought down people from Canal Barge to help with the training and all that sort of thing. And all went pretty good, and everything worked pretty good. But what I noticed was when I was down there that the new president that was in Colombia at that time had pushed the FARC all the way to the borders and was about to eliminate the FARC, and all of a sudden Chavez lets him into Venezuela. And then all of a sudden, all the rumors of drugs in Venezuela and how Venezuela continued to go downhill, and they had all these problems and everything. And then I read in New York Times when I was down there that the #1 supplier of cocaine from to the U.S. was from Apuri, Venezuela. Of course, Apuri was the town I flew into when I navigated the river. And the governor of Apuri State at that time was Hugo Chavez's father. So I don't know there's anything to the story, but in my mind, I'm convinced that one reason they wanted the river surveyed was so that people would know where to get away from authorities and where the shallow spots were. I think they were more interested in that than they were the deep spots. But I have nothing to prove that story, but I thought it was an interesting story and I thought it'd be something to share with you.
And I do appreciate it, sir. I guess what keep walking me through. I'm glad also that you mentioned Captain Tammy White. I've been trying to chase him on Facebook for quite some time.
I'll get him. I'll get him for you, my friend.
There's a mutual connection. It hasn't quite worked out yet. So I hope he's out there and interested. But what's next for you? When did you?
He texted me today. He texted me today on your post.
Okay.
So yeah, I know Tammy real well. We're really good friends. I thank the world, Tammy. Talk about a pilot. Oh, that fellow's a good pilot. So anyway, I'll tell you a couple other interesting things. So I finished with my work there in Colombia and retired for a second time and moved back to Fort Myers, Florida, where we were living. My wife graduated with her master's degree from Hodges University there in Fort Myers, and she did a lot of that while I was working in Colombia. And when I moved back to Fort Myers, is another interesting story is that I got hired by the Minnesota Twins to teach their Latin players English. The Minnesota Twins have their camp there, their spring camp in Fort Myers. And I had a lot of different students. I made a lot of friends with a lot of people with the Twins. And a couple of people I had were students is Luisa Reyes. And that might not mean much to anybody. Luisa Reyes has led the National League and American League in hitting 2 of the last 3 years, and looks like he's going to win again this year. And he's also been the only one other player in the history of baseball has won the batting crown in both the American League and the National League. He was traded from the Twins to the Marlins and traded from the Marlins back to the Padres. He's playing with the Padres. And in fact, I saw him in St. Louis last month when I was up there. We went to Padre game, we were by the dugout, and I yelled at him. He came over and we talked for a few minutes before the game started. A really nice kid. And a couple more players that I had were, and Luis Reyes was from Venezuela. Another guy from Venezuela named Brusdar Gratterall. He's one of the closers for the Dodgers. Another one by the name of Johan Duran. He was from the Dominican. He's the closer for the Twins, and he's the first pitcher in Twins history to throw a baseball 105 miles an hour. So interesting that learning my Spanish in Venezuela gave me an opportunity to get acquainted with some really, really interesting people in the world of baseball.
Yes, indeed. You've had quite the fascinating life. What have you been keeping yourself busy with since your retirement? And how is your grandchild? I know we had to postpone for an illness, I think.
Yeah, I thank you. He's doing well, and he's at his mother's this evening, and he's not here. So was a whole lot easier doing this interview without him here, I'll assure you. He's a wonderful kid, though. He's 3.5, going to be 4, and just the joy of our life. I have 3 grandchildren. My daughter lives in the St. Louis area in Godfrey, Illinois still, and I have 2 granddaughters there. And then our daughter, Catherine, Luisa, and my daughter, Catherine, has our grandson, Aston, and they live here in Florida, in Miami.
Well, did they keep you busy enough, or are you still digging into things?
No, I still keep my hands in some things. I mean, the other recent thing that I did, I had 2 other jobs after I left Trafigura. I was hired by Jeff Boat to try to sell barges into South America, and I did that for a year with them. Worked with Patrick Sutton and Mark Hanoi was there at the time. Really 2 very, very nice human beings, those 2 real gentlemen, those 2. And I worked on trying to sell barges into South America for them. We did not get that done, and then they closed the shipyard. So, but I spent 1.5 years doing that after Trafigura, and then I also was trying to sell equipment that was in Venezuela out of the country to other people. And I met some people with Brazil and some other places. And that kind of fell through too because the government just made it so difficult to try to do business that we just weren't able to do it.
Is there anything else to share from a 35-year career? Any other highlights or lowlights or challenges? Maybe paint the picture of the industry in 1973 versus 2023.
Yeah, it's consolidated. When I started in 72, we were there. I remember we played some softball games with a couple teams. PV Barge Lines they were out of Alton. CVGB would come over, and another couple teams. Valley Line, I think, and then a year or so, and we actually played in Hartford. They'd all come to Hartford. We had ball diamonds there, really nice ball diamonds there in Hartford, in that little town, and they were lighted and everything. And then the next year they started a tournament over in St. Louis, and I think there were 12 teams in it, and that thing expanded into one of the biggest events in the river industry, the St. Louis softball tournament that they have, and I think they had 30, 40 teams in it. When I went to Venezuela, I'm not quite sure what the status of it is today, but the point I was going to make is there were so many companies, we had so many teams, and now all that's consolidated. And the river industry is really a lot different than it was when I was there. When I first started, there were just bukus of small companies, and there was a lot of competition and a lot of opportunities, and it just got consolidated. And I'm convinced that one of the things that consolidated quickly was CSX buying ACBL, because they not only bought SCNO, then they bought Valley Lines, they bought 2 or 3 other lines, towing companies. I do have one little interesting story I'll tell you about my brother John. John was working with me at SCNO, and I told him, I said, John, I really think he should go work for somebody else, because I think families working in the same company is probably not a good thing. So he left and got a couple other jobs, did a couple other things. Then all of a sudden, ACBL buys SCNO, and then they bought the company John was working for, and John and I were back working together. So
Can't stay away, can you?
there you go.
Well, anyway, sir, no, I think that was certainly all the questions I had. Yeah, no, thanks very much for your time this afternoon here. Glad we could finally make this one work.
I just want to tell you, I like what you're doing. I think you're going the right direction with this thing. It sounds like you've talked to some really good people in what you're doing. If I can help you in any way, please feel free to ask. I'd be glad to do it. And I enjoy what you do. And for people that are acquainted with the river, it's a big deal. And people that don't know the river, they just don't know the river. They don't know all the good people that work in the industry.
Certainly trying to raise awareness. I could use some more attention though. Some more subscribers and likes and comments and shares. So by all means, if you see something you like, please share it, broadcast it to your network. I'd ask that of anybody out there watching or listening as well.
You have it, my friend. Well, thank you for your time, Tim.
Yes, sir. Thanks very much.
All right. God bless.
This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.